I'll burn your house down with you still inside it. That wasn't shouted in panic or thrown out as a careless insult. It was delivered flat, deliberate, like a statement someone had already decided was true. And before the words even finished settling, the engine screamed and the Mustang tore across my lawn like the ground didn't exist to stop it. The tires didn't just spin, they ripped, chewing through soil I had spent months restoring, spraying mud across everything in reach while the front end plowed through rows of roses that had taken patience, time, and something close to therapy to grow. $3,000 of work disappeared in seconds, but the money wasn't the part that hit. It was what that lawn meant, because I didn't build it to impress anyone. I built it to fix something that had been broken long before I ever moved there. And standing just off the edge of it all, phone raised, recording like she was documenting something worth celebrating, was HOA Karen. She wasn't shocked. She wasn't reacting. She was smiling. I heard her voice cut through the engine noise. Calm, controlled, like she had rehearsed the moment before it ever happened. Maybe now you'll understand where you belong. The smell hit next. Burnt rubber, torn roots, wet soil, something sharp and chemical layered over something organic and ruined, and it stayed in the air like a reminder that this wasn't going to be cleaned up by hosing it down and pretending it didn't happen. That's when it clicked. This wasn't a kid losing control. This wasn't a mistake. This was coordinate. Before we move forward, drop a comment. Where are you watching from? Because what happened next didn't come from anger, didn't come from shouting, and didn't come from trying to outmatch someone who thought intimidation was the same thing as power. What happened next came from something slower, quieter, and far more dangerous to people like them. I didn't fight back. I let them keep going. 3 months before that moment, I thought I had stepped into something steady. Not perfect, not exciting, just steady. After 22 years in the military and a divorce that stripped everything down to what actually mattered, I wasn't chasing anything big. I just wanted a place where nothing needed to be constantly defended. Willowbrook Estates looked like that place the first time I drove through it. Everything was controlled, but not in a way that felt oppressive first glance. Clean streets, even spacing, mailboxes aligned like they had been measured instead of placed, lawns that looked identical at a distance but held just enough variation to feel intentional. And every morning at exactly 6, the sprinklers came on across the neighborhood in near perfect sync, a quiet, mechanical rhythm that replaced alarms and reminders. I got used to that sound fast. After years of unpredictability, routine didn't feel boring. It felt stable. My house sat at the end of a cul-de-sac where movement slowed naturally, where people walked dogs instead of rushing past, where conversations happened without urgency. Across the street were the Hendersons, 85 and 82, and still moving through life with the kind of consistency that made everything else seem temporary. They brought cookies the first week, not store-bought, homemade, and when they handed them over, there was something else in the exchange, something unspoken but present, like they wanted to say more but didn't know how much I needed to hear yet. 2 houses down was Maria Santos with her twin boys, and every evening the sound of a basketball hitting pavement echoed just long enough to remind you people still lived there, not just maintained appearances. That sound became background noise while I worked, and I worked a lot. I didn't hire anyone, didn't outsource it. I rebuilt the yard myself, stone by stone, section by section. I laid walkways that actually followed how people moved instead of how they looked on paper. I planted roses that required attention, not just watering, because I needed something that demanded consistency without chaos. I installed irrigation that made sure everything stayed balanced, not flooded, not dry, just maintained. The soil under my nails stopped feeling like dirt and started feeling like progress. And by the time spring settled in, people started noticing, not in a loud way, not in a way that drew attention, just small pauses, a glance that lasted a second long, a comment during a walk that didn't need to be said but was. That's when it started. Because attention doesn't just bring approval, it brings control. HOA Karen lived at the far end of the cul-de-sac in a house that didn't just stand out, it dominated the space around. White columns, perfect symmetry, no visible maintenance. Everything about it said the same thing without needing words. She had been HOA president for 8 years, and she didn't manage the neighborhood. She controlled it. Her inspections weren't casual. They were scheduled, structured, and precise. And that clipboard she carried wasn't for notes. It was for decisions. The sound of her nails tapping against it during those walks became something people recognized before they even saw her, like a signal, like something to prepare for. Trevor was the extension of everything she didn't need to say out loud. 19. No consequences. 2 wrecked cars already behind him, and each replacement louder than the last. The red Mustang wasn't transportation. It was noise. It was presence. It was disruption made visible. Every time he drove through the neighborhood, it wasn't movement. It was performance. And nobody stopped him. Not because they didn't see it, because they understood the system. She controlled the rules. He ignored them. And between those two things, there was no space left for anyone else to act. I learned that 3 weeks after I moved in. He parked in front of a fire hydrant during a gathering at the Hendersons' place. Not slightly off, not close, directly in front of it. So I reported it, not to start anything, just because it needed to be addressed. The next morning, the notices were on my door. Mailbox height violation, garden edging inconsistency, irrigation noise disturbance. Every one of them false. Every one of them structured to cost time, money, or both. When I went to her door, she answered like she had been waiting for me. The smile didn't welcome conversation. It controlled it. Some people struggle to adapt to community standards, she said. Tone smooth, controlled. I'd hate for that to become a problem for you. That night, Trevor drove past my house 17 times. Not random, not spaced out, deliberate. Each pass louder than the last. Each turn sharper, each stop shorter. The message wasn't hidden. It didn't need to be. And standing there, watching the smoke drift over something I had built to feel stable, I realized something that changed everything. I hadn't moved into a peaceful neighborhood. I had moved into a controlled one. And control like that doesn't disappear when challenged. It escalates. I didn't respond the next morning, and that was the first move that actually mattered, because reacting would have fed exactly what HOA Karen was building, and I could already see the structure taking shape even if nobody else was saying it out loud. The notices stayed on the counter where I could see them without touching them, because I needed to understand what they were, not just what they said. And what they were wasn't enforcement. It was positioning. Every line was written to look official. Every violation framed to sound legitimate. But none of them aligned with what actually existed on the ground. And that gap between reality and paperwork was the first crack in something much bigger. I didn't call her, didn't knock on her door again, didn't try to argue a point she wasn't interested in hearing, because arguments don't work when the other side isn't trying to be right. They're trying to be in control. Instead, I slowed everything down and went back to something I understood better than anything else: documentation. 22 years in the military teaches you one thing above everything else. If it isn't recorded, it didn't happen. And if it isn't organized, it won't matter when it needs to. I started with what I already had, then expanded it until there were no gaps left to question. Cameras went up first, not as a reaction, but as a system. Front, side, rear. Each one placed to eliminate blind spots. Each one calibrated to capture movement, not just presence. Night vision, timestamps, motion triggers, everything synchronized so that nothing could be isolated from the timeline it existed in. The sound of those systems activating became routine, quiet, consistent, the opposite of the chaos that had been introduced into the space. Alongside that, I built a record that didn't rely on memory. A notebook, not digital, not something that could be altered without trace, but something physical, something that carried weight with every entry. Dates, times, descriptions, exact sequences of events. Every detail written down the same way, without emotion, without interpretation, just facts placed in order. Within a week, the pattern started to form without needing explanation. 17 separate entries, all connected, all consistent, all pointing in the same direction. Noise violations, property damage, intimidation passes, each one tied to Trevor, each one occurring within a structure that matched the notices being issued by HOA Karen. That's when I assembled the complaint. Not rushed, not thrown together, but structured with the same discipline I had applied to everything else. 12 pages, organized, supported, each section building on the last without leaving room for dismissal. Photos that didn't exaggerate anything because they didn't need to. Witness statements that didn't speculate, just confirmed what had already been seen. Maria confirmed the late-night driving. The Hendersons provided video clips they hadn't wanted to use before, and even Mrs. Patterson contributed footage that had been sitting unused because she didn't want attention. I didn't mail it, didn't submit it through a system that could bury it. I delivered it directly, placed it in her hands, so there was no question about whether she had received it. That should have changed something if the system worked the way it was supposed to. It didn't. Her response came back in less than 2 days, and it didn't acknowledge a single point I had raised. 3 more violations, each one more detached from reality than the last, each one structured to create pressure instead of resolution. Mailbox height off by 2 inches, something that hadn't changed since the day I moved in. Garden edging inconsistent, even though it matched the same pattern used across the neighborhood. Irrigation noise disturbance, even though it operated within the same schedule as every other system on the street. $600 in fines, with daily penalties that escalate if I didn't comply immediately. That's when the shift happened internally. Not anger, not frustration, but clarity. Because I had already read the HOA covenant before I ever submitted the complaint. All 40 7 pages of it. Every clause, every requirement, every process that had to be followed before anything like that could be enforced. Section 12.3 was clear. Violations required 14 days written notice before any fine could be applied. She skipped it entirely, which meant every notice she issued wasn't just invalid, it created liability, not for the HOA, for her. And that changed the position completely, because now the pressure wasn't just one direction anymore. But I didn't act on that either, because timing matters more than discovery. Instead, I let the notices accumulate, each one adding to the record, each one reinforcing the same pattern. At the same time, the neighborhood started to shift around me in ways that were harder to document, but just as real. People who had been open became distant. Conversations shortened. Eye contact disappeared. The Hendersons apologized without saying why, their voices lower than usual, their presence more cautious. Maria kept her boys closer to home. The basketball didn't bounce as far. The sound didn't carry the same way. Nobody said anything directly, but the message moved through the neighborhood without needing to be spoken. This is what happens when you don't fall in line. The block party meeting made that visible. I showed up, not expecting anything different, but needing to confirm it, and when the door stayed closed, that confirmation came without explanation. HOA. Karen opened it just enough to speak, not enough to invite. "This meeting is for residents in good standing," she said, like it was policy, not decision. Inside, people avoided looking up, not because they agreed, but because they didn't want to be seen agreeing or disagreeing. That's how systems like this maintain control, not through support, but through silence. That night, Trevor escalated again, not with noise, but with intent. Eggs thrown with precision, covering surfaces that required effort to clean, targeting areas that had taken time to build. The smell hit first. Sharp, sour, lingering longer than it should, mixing with the quiet of the night in a way that made the act feel deliberate, not impulsive. I stood there washing it off, not rushing, not reacting, just observing. Because by then, it was clear this wasn't random. It was structured, repeated, predictable. And predictability changes everything. Because once something follows a pattern, it can be studied. And once it can be studied, it can be used. That realization didn't come with a plan immediately. It came with a shift in perspective. I stopped looking at what they were doing as individual actions and started looking at it as a sequence. Violation notice, intimidation, escalation, silence, repeat. The same cycle over and over, not just with me but with others if you looked closely enough. And that's when the situation stopped being something I was dealing with and became something I was building around. Because once you understand the system, you don't fight it directly. You let it expose itself. Once I stopped looking at what was happening as isolated incidents and started mapping it as a system, the entire neighborhood shifted in my mind from a collection of houses into something far more structured, something that operated with rules that weren't written down anywhere but were enforced more aggressively than anything printed in the HOA handbook. HOA Karen didn't just manage compliance, she engineered it. And the way she did it wasn't by applying rules equally. It was by choosing when and where they mattered. The covenants existed, but they weren't the authority. They were the tool, something she could pick up or ignore depending on what outcome she wanted. And Trevor wasn't just a problem she tolerated. He was the enforcement mechanism that made everything else work. The pattern became clearer the more I reviewed what I had already documented, not just on my property, but in the fragments of information that had been sitting around me since I moved in. Trevor didn't drive randomly. He targeted. His routes weren't based on convenience. They were based on visibility and impact. He chose moments when people were present, when damage would be seen, when disruption would carry beyond the act itself. And every time that happened, something followed it. A notice, a warning, a shift in behavior from the people around him. It wasn't coincidence. It was sequence. I started noticing how the pressure moved through the neighborhood. It didn't hit everyone at once. It focused, narrowed, applied itself to one house, one person, one situation at a time, until that person either complied or withdrew. And once that happened, it moved on. That's how it stayed effective, by never creating a moment where everyone pushed back at once. Isolation wasn't a side effect. It was the method. Maria's situation confirmed that. One evening, when the street was quieter than usual, and the usual noise of her boys playing had already faded, she came over, not casually, not the way neighbors usually do, but with the kind of hesitation that comes from deciding whether saying something is worth the risk. She didn't start with Trevor. She started with her guard. 3 months of work gone in less than a minute. Fence broken, plants destroyed, soil torn up in a way that didn't match an accident. She never reported it, not because she didn't want to, but because she knew what would follow. The Hendersons added to that without realizing they were doing it. A story about Trevor backing into the wrong driveway and destroying something that had been there longer than most of the houses around. They didn't call it intentional. They didn't need to. The way they described it, the way they avoided details, filled in what they didn't say. Mrs. Patterson had footage that went back further than anything I had. Clips of the same car, the same behavior, the same pattern repeating in different places with the same outcome. None of them had put it together, not because they couldn't, but because they didn't think it mattered individually. But once it was placed side by side, it stopped being individual. It became structured. Trevor didn't just create damage, he created pressure. HOA Karen didn't just enforce rules, she directed outcomes. And between those two roles, the system maintained itself without needing to be explained. The next layer became visible when I looked at timing. Trevor's activity increased before notices appeared, not after. The intimidation came first. The paperwork followed, which meant the paperwork wasn't a reaction. It was reinforcement. It justified what had already been done, reframed it in a way that shifted responsibility away from him and onto whoever had been targeted. That's how the system held together, not by denying reality, but by redefining it after the fact. The social layer completed. Conversations changed before official actions happened. People withdrew before notices were issued. It moved through the neighborhood faster than anything written could. And that's when I understood the full structure. This wasn't about maintaining standards. It was about controlling movement. Who stayed, who left, who complied, who resisted. And once that understanding settled in, something else started to emerge beneath: motivation. Because systems like that don't exist without a reason. Control alone isn't enough to sustain that level of consistency. There had to be something else driving, something that made the risk worth maintaining. That's when I started paying attention to what happened after people stopped pushing back. Houses changed hands. Not immediately, not in a way that drew attention, but consistently enough to be noticed once you looked for it. Properties that had been occupied for years suddenly listed. Prices slightly below what similar houses were going for. Sales that moved faster than expected. And in each case, the timing aligned with what I was already seeing. Pressure, escalation, withdrawal, sale. The pattern extended beyond behavior into outcome. And once that connection formed, everything else around it started to make sense. HOA Karen wasn't just maintaining control for its own sake. She was directing it towards something. And Trevor wasn't just acting out. He was part of the mechanism that made it possible. That realization didn't trigger action immediately. It triggered focus. Because once motive enters the equation, the entire structure becomes something that can be exposed, not just challenged. And exposure doesn't require confrontation. It requires proof. Once the structure revealed itself, I stopped looking at the surface complete, because surface level behavior can be denied, reframed, or dismissed. But what sits underneath it leaves traces that don't disappear when someone tries to control the narrative. I shifted my focus away from Trevor entirely and toward the systems that allowed him to keep doing exactly what he had been doing without interruption. That meant records, boundaries, transactions, and anything that existed outside of HOA Karen's immediate influence. The first move was verifying something I had assumed was already correct: the property line. Not the version that existed in HOA documents, or the one people referenced casually when they talked about where one yard ended and another began, but the actual legal bound recorded at the county level. I brought in a professional surveyor, not because I expected something dramatic, but because I needed certainty. The process itself was methodical. Equipment placed at fixed points, measurements taken against original records, markers set where the line actually existed instead of where it had been treated as existing. When it was done, the result didn't just confirm ownership, it corrected it. My property extended further than the HOA's working assumption, further than what had been enforced for years, which meant every pass Trevor had made across what he believed was shared or neutral space was actually a direct violation of defined property. That single adjustment didn't change what had happened, it changed how it was classified. What had been dismissed as reckless driving now carried the weight of repeated trespass. And because it had been documented, not once, but consistently, the pattern became legally relevant instead of socially inconvenient. I didn't act on it immediately, because proof gains value when it aligns with timing. Instead, I expanded outward. If the boundary had been misrepresented, what else had been treated as fact without verification? That question led me to records that most people never look at because they don't seem necessary until they are. County filings, transaction histories, permit applications, all of it public, all of it accessible, all of it ignored by anyone who didn't have a reason to dig through it. I started with with property sales within the neighborhood over the past few years. Not just prices, but timing, ownership changes, and the entities involved in those transactions. At first it looked like normal turnover, houses changing hands the way they do in any neighborhood. But when I aligned those sales with the pattern I had already documented, pressure, escalation, withdrawal, the timing wasn't random anymore. Properties that experienced sustained harassment didn't just change hands. They did it within a specific window after the pressure peaked. Not immediately, not delayed, but within a range that suggested decision-making under sustained stress. The pricing followed the same pattern, slightly below comparable values, just enough to move quickly, not enough to raise suspicion without context. That's when the second layer became visible. The same name appeared repeatedly in the transaction records, not always as the buyer, not always as the seller, but as the intermediary, the real estate office handling the deals, HOA Karen's office. That connection didn't prove intent on its own, but it established proximity. She wasn't just involved in the neighborhood structurally, she was positioned to benefit from its movement. I expanded further. HOA financial records, available in summary form, enough to show patterns without revealing every detail. Fines collected, fees applied, administrative costs, all of it moving through accounts that didn't always align cleanly with the stated purpose. It wasn't obvious at first, but when placed alongside the timeline of violations and property changes, discrepancies started to form. Amounts that increased during periods of heightened enforcement, costs that didn't correspond to actual services provided, transfers that appeared routine until you tracked where they ended up. That's when the system fully exposed itself. The enforcement wasn't random, the pressure wasn't personal, it was functional. It created movement, and that movement created opportunity. Trevor's role fit into that structure without needing explanation anymore. He wasn't just acting out, he was accelerating the process, creating conditions that made staying difficult enough to consider leaving, and HOA Karen ensured that once that consideration existed, it moved in a direction she could control. The final piece came from something that had been present from the beginning, but hadn't been fully utilized. The footage, not just mine, but everything that had been collected across the neighborhood once people started sharing it without needing to formalize anything. Different angles, different times, different properties, all showing the same behavior, the same vehicle, the same sequence. When aligned with the survey results, those videos didn't just show damage, they showed repeated entry across defined boundaries. When aligned with the financial records, they showed timing that matched enforcement cycles. When aligned with the property transactions, they showed pressure that preceded movement. It wasn't one piece of evidence that made it clear. It was all of them together, reinforcing the same conclusion from different directions. And that's when the approach became obvious. I didn't need to confront anything. I didn't need to accuse anyone. Everything that needed to be shown was already in place. It just needed to be presented at the moment where it couldn't be redirected, denied, or minimized. And that moment wasn't something I had to create. It was something Trevor was going to walk into on his own, because patterns don't change when the person following them doesn't know anything has shifted. I didn't trigger anything, and that's the part most people misunderstand when they try to force outcomes instead of letting them reveal themselves, because forcing a moment gives the other side something to react to, but letting them walk into it removes that option completely. Trevor didn't know anything had changed, and that was exactly what made it work. He approached the same way he always did. Same speed, same angle, same confidence that came from repetition without consequence. The Mustang cut off the pavement and entered my property like it had done before. Tires hitting soil that looked the same, felt the same on the surface, and gave no immediate signal that anything underneath it had shifted. The first few feet looked identical to every other pass he had made, which is exactly why he didn't slow down. That's when the difference started. The ground didn't hold the same way it had before. Not visibly at first, not enough to stop the vehicle outright, but enough to disrupt the control he relied on. The tires sank just enough to change the response, just enough to require correction, and instead of adjusting, he accelerated, because that's what had always worked before. The engine roared, the wheels spun, and instead of pushing forward, the car settled deeper. That moment, the exact point where expectation and reality separate, was where everything shifted. He tried again, harder this time, forcing power into something that wasn't responding the way he expected, and the result didn't change, it intensified. The rear end dropped further, the front lost alignment, and the Mustang stopped moving in any direction that mattered. The sound drew attention immediately, not because it was new, but because it didn't resolve the way it usually did. People stepped outside, not cautiously, not from behind curtains, but directly, because what they were hearing didn't follow the pattern they had become used to ignoring. Trevor didn't get out right away. He stayed in the car, pushing the engine harder, as if force alone could reverse what had already happened. happened. The tires spun faster, the ground displaced more, and the situation locked itself into place. When he finally stepped out, it wasn't controlled, it wasn't confident, it was reaction. He looked at the ground, at the car, at the position he was in, and for the first time, there was no immediate adjustment available. HOA Karen arrived within minutes, not with the same composure she had carried before, but with urgency that showed she understood something had changed, even if she didn't know exactly what. She moved toward the situation quickly, scanning, calculating, trying to place control back into something that had already moved beyond her reach. She didn't ask what happened. She didn't need to. She moved straight into defining it. "This is unsafe," she said, voice raised just enough to reach everyone who had gathered. "You've created a hazard." The words followed the same structure she had used every time before. Take the situation, remove context, apply authority, shift responsibility. But this time, the context was visible in a way that couldn't be removed. The car wasn't near the edge. It wasn't partially across a boundary. It was fully inside it, past a line that had been measured, marked, and documented. And that changed the weight of every word she said before she said it. I didn't respond immediately, because responding too early would have allowed her to shape the moment around the response instead of the fact. The cameras were recording. The people were watching. The position was clear. When I did speak, it wasn't directed at her. It was directed at what couldn't be changed. "He's on my property." That was it. No emphasis, no argument, no expansion. Just the statement that aligned everything in that moment. She tried to redirect again, to reframe it, to bring it back into something she could control, but the space for that was gone. Because the more she spoke, the more it conflicted with what everyone could already see. Trevor tried to get the car moving again, stepping back in, pushing the engine harder, but the result didn't change. The deeper he pushed, the more the situation closed in on itself. That's when the call came. Not from me, not directed, not coordinated, but inevitable. Because once something reaches that level of visibility, someone steps outside the system to address it. When the deputies arrived, the shift completed. This wasn't an HOA situation anymore. It wasn't internal. It wasn't controlled by notices or interpretations. It moved into a space where authority followed structure, not influence. They didn't ask broad questions. They asked specific ones. Where is the boundary? Who owns the property? What happened before the vehicle entered it? The answers didn't require explanation. The markers were visible. The footage was available. The pattern had already been established before they stepped out of the car. HOA Karen tried to speak into it, but the tone she used in HOA meetings didn't carry here. Authority didn't come from position in this moment. It came from facts, and facts were already in place. Trevor didn't have anything to say that could change what had happened. Not because he chose silence, but because nothing he said would move the situation back into something he could control. The car was removed under direction that didn't come from her. The documentation stayed intact. The sequence didn't reset. And the people who had been watching for months didn't step back into silence, because once something becomes clear at that level, it doesn't return to being ignored. That's where the collapse actually happened. Not when the car stopped moving, not when the deputies arrived, but when the system that had been controlling everything lost the ability to define what was happening in front of everyone at the same time. Once the situation moved outside HOA Karen's control, it didn't slow down, it accelerated, because systems that operate on influence collapse quickly when they're forced into structures that operate on verification. The deputies didn't resolve anything on the spot beyond what they were required to do, but they didn't need to, because what mattered had already been recorded, aligned, and preserved in a way that could be reviewed without interpretation. That's where the next phase began, not with confrontation, but with translation, taking everything that had been documented and placing it into the systems designed to evaluate it without bias. I didn't rush it, didn't scatter the information across different channels, didn't dilute it with unnecessary additions. I organized it, refined it, and presented it where it would matter most. The survey documentation came first, establishing the boundary as a fixed, verified fact that could not be argued by HOA standards or neighborhood assumptions. Every video that followed was aligned with that boundary, showing not just movement, but entry across a defined line, repeated, consistent, undeniable. The violation notices issued by HOA Karen were included, not as separate incidents, but as part of the same sequence, demonstrating how enforcement followed intimidation instead of preceding it. The financial records added weight in a different direction, showing that the outcomes of that pressure weren't neutral, they were beneficial to the same person controlling the the system. When all of that was placed together, it stopped being a dispute and became a pattern that required review at a level beyond HOA authority. That's when legal representation entered the picture, not as a reaction, but as a structured response to something that had already been built. The attorney didn't need to create a case. The case already existed. What they did was align it with the appropriate frameworks, ensuring that every piece of documentation was placed where it would carry the most weight. Trespass became repeated violation instead of isolated incidents. Fabricated notices became evidence of misuse of authority. Financial discrepancies became indicators of potential misconduct rather than administrative error. Each element strengthened the others, not by repetition, but by connection. At the same time, external agencies began their own processes, not because they were asked to, but because the information met the threshold required to initiate review. Property boundaries, enforcement procedures, financial handling, all of it fell under different areas of oversight. And once those areas were engaged, the situation expanded beyond anything that could be contained locally. HOA Karen's position shifted rapidly in that environment. The authority she held within the neighborhood didn't transfer into these systems because those systems don't recognize influence the same way. They recognize documentation, compliance, and consistency. And the more the situation was reviewed, the more the inconsistencies became visible. The notices she had issued didn't align with required procedures. The timing of enforcement didn't match the structure defined in the covenants. The financial records didn't correspond cleanly with the stated purpose of the funds being collected. None of those points alone would have been enough to dismantle what she had built. But together, they formed a structure that couldn't hold under scrutiny. Trevor's role was redefined at the same time. What had been dismissed as reckless behavior became repeated violation tied to documented boundaries. The footage removed any ambiguity about intent. The pattern removed any argument about accident. And once those elements were placed into a system that evaluated them without the ability to redirect, the outcome followed naturally. The neighborhood began to shift again, but this time the movement was different. It wasn't withdrawal. It wasn't silence. It was recognition. People who had avoided involvement before started acknowledging what had been happening, not because they suddenly changed, but because the structure that had kept them silent was no longer in place. HOA Karen's ability to apply pressure disappeared as quickly as it had been established, because it depended entirely on her control of the system, and that control no longer existed in the same way. The board itself began to fracture, not dramatically, not publicly at first, but internally, as the realization spread that what had been accepted as normal wasn't defensible once it was examined outside of the environment it had been maintained in. The outcome didn't arrive in a single moment. It unfolded through processes that followed their own timelines, each one reinforcing the same conclusion. Enforcement actions were reviewed. Financial handling was questioned. Authority was challenged in a way that required response rather than avoidance. And through all of it, nothing needed to be forced, because the structure that had been built to control others couldn't support itself once it was placed under the same level of scrutiny it had been used to apply. That's where the real retaliation occurred, not through confrontation, but through exposure. Because once something is fully visible in the right system, it doesn't need to be attacked. It resolves itself. When everything settled, there wasn't a moment that felt like a win, because what replaced everything that had been happening wasn't victory, it was absence. The noise stopped first. Not gradually, not reduced, but completely gone, in a way that made the quiet feel different from before. Not peaceful, just unoccupied. The yard didn't look the same as it had originally, because restoration doesn't erase what happened, it moves forward from it. The soil had been turned more than once, the layout adjusted, the structure reinforced in ways that didn't draw attention, but held under pressure. The roses were replanted, not in the exact same positions, but in a pattern that reflected what had been learned rather than what had lost. The irrigation ran on the same schedule, the sound returning to something familiar, but it didn't carry the same meaning. It wasn't a signal of routine. It was just a system functioning the way it was supposed to. The neighborhood shifted in ways that didn't need to be announced. Conversations returned, not all at once, not loudly, but in small, consistent interactions that didn't carry the hesitation they had before. The Hendersons walked the same route they always had, but without the pauses that had been introduced during everything that happened. Maria's boys played again, the sound of the ball returning to the pavement without interruption. Nothing about it was dramatic. That's what made it real. HOA Karen wasn't present anymore, not in the way she had been. The absence didn't come with explanation, didn't come with closure. It just existed, like something that had been removed without needing to be replaced. Trevor didn't return either, not even as noise in distance. The system that had supported him wasn't there any, and without it, the pattern didn't continue. The documents stayed where they had been placed, not displayed, not referenced, but preserved, because the value in them wasn't in what they proved after the fact, it was in what they prevented from happening again. I didn't revisit the process, didn't go back through the footage, didn't re-examine the sequence. There was no need to. Everything that had been established remained in place without requiring attention, and that's how the situation ended. Not with confrontation, not with a final exchange, not with anything that needed to be said, just with everything that had been built on control no longer having anything left to stand on.